lecture recital, and my topic is Shostakovich Violin Sonata, opus 134, Shostakovich and David Oistrakh's legacy. I would like to start with the biggest thank you for the opportunity to be here at the Boston University as a student, and to my Professor Beilakais for giving so much energy and dedication into my learning process, and also picking this topic for me. I would also thank Professor Lorena Tecu, who was helping with my writing process for this class, pianist Lorena Tecu, who played all my recitals with me, and also this very challenging piece, and also Professors Emeritus Dana and Yuri Mazurkevich, who I studied here in master's degree, and Professor Dmitri Shostakovich with his all support also for my degree, and also for being my evaluator for this recital. Growing up in Latvia, it was already a post-Soviet country, but there was a lot of spoken elements about horrific censorship and concentration camps of Stalin, where my grandfather Janis Regis also was imprisoned and suffered. Today, there's also a very complex relationship in between Baltic states and Russian Federation, as well as military conflict in Ukraine with Russia. And there is some resistance of playing Russian music, especially coming from the Western point, because of these conflicts. But Shostakovich remains one of the composers that people are gladly playing because of the messages in his music, which are against the censorship and Stalin's regime. My high school violin teacher was Andris Baumanis, who studied at the Moscow Conservatory. He didn't study with Oistrakh, but he studied with Barinova, but he admired Oistrakh and talked about him a lot in my lessons. He liked contemporary repertoire. He gave very difficult pieces for me to practice, and he gave me Shostakovich's Violin Concerto No. 2 for my graduation recital in high school. I was very lucky and blessed to study with both Dana and Yuri Mazurkevich, who both studied with David Oistrakh in Moscow Conservatory, so they carry the legacy of Oistrakh's sound. And together with Dana Mazurkevich, I learned the first violin concerto and played for Shostakovich's first violin concerto, and played for my master's graduation recital. Shostakovich was very lucky because he collaborated with distinguished Soviet violinist Oistrakh. They first met in Turkey in semi-official tour, and they played together Shostakovich's piano trio in 1935. Both of them taught at the Moscow Conservatory, Shostakovich only for 5 years, but Oistrakh for stunning 40 years, and he raised generations of violinists who went everywhere abroad and also stayed in Russia. And it was incredible for violin playing, for violin school. But dedications to Oistrakh, Shostakovich started dedicating only in 1947, and he dedicated his violin concertos. Oistrakh fingered on both the parts. His fingerings are very well known to be musical. They are challenging. They go high on one string, but they serve musical purpose in the playing. The brief historical background. It was composed in 1968 for Oistrakh's 60th birthday, but it came 1 year early, so Oistrakh was only 59, so he made a mistake, so he also composed the Violin Concerto No. 2 for his 60th birthday. It is one of his late period compositions. We probably all know that Shostakovich has 3 string sonatas: the cello sonata, which is his early work, the violin sonata, which is late period work, and the viola sonata, which was his last composition. This sonata is unfinished work, and there's evidence of that in the first movement. It is composed in times of censorship and written already 15 years after Stalin's death, so there is some freedom already in his expression. It's very motivic. It was premiered 1 year later in 1969 with Sviatoslav Richter. Richter and Oistrakh knew each other for a long time because they together studied in Odessa Conservatory, which is in modern day Ukraine. The work, which began on June 26, was not finished either the same summer of 1968 or any later time. The manuscript breaks off abruptly. The composer intended to continue the work, having designed the beginning of development section, but this intention was not carried out and the sonata remained unfinished. And there is this book by Ekimowski, the volumes of Shostakovich's work, and there is one particular Russian scholar who claims that sonata was already started in 1945. I don't have any other evidence of that, because all other papers say it was written in 1968, but the themes surface in the 10th symphony, so there's a lot of similarities. It also became part of Tchaikovsky violin competition, and it was played, because it's really, really difficult, it beat as a competition piece. A little bit about Shostakovich. It's socialist realism. Also, this particular sonata is also influenced by Baroque forms, 12-tone technique and chromaticism all mixed in one piece. His music contains humor, grotesque, satire, and Russian folk music elements, and a lot of coded messages against the Soviet censorship. It also includes short, repetitive figures, and of course the DSCH motif. The music really reflects the historical time of the Soviet Union, where people were censored and afraid of KGB, Stalin's prosecutions, and gulags. These are the very popular books by Solomon Volkov that I also read, The Testimony and Shostakovich and Stalin, but there's a lot of questionable authenticity. Shostakovich's best friend Boris Tishenko and his widow Irina Shostakovich said that there's a lot of things in these books that are actually not true, because Shostakovich was a very complex personality, and it was positioned from Western perspective to show Shostakovich from one side, idealizing him, but there were a lot of things that were not true. Richard Teruskin in his Slavic review said, I always sensed intuitively in Shostakovich's music a protest against the regime. And these are the books that I used. And I recommend everybody to check out the Shostakovich Volume 106, 107, and 108, not only because it contains the music and handwritten manuscripts, but also Russian scholar articles, how they analyzed Shostakovich's work and composition process. When Soviet artists began concertizing in the West, they were not just themselves. They were vehicles to demonstrate accomplishments of Soviet culture in the most potentially hostile environments of the Cold War. They were followed by KGB agents. They were not allowed to talk. And it was a very tense environment and put a lot of pressure to Shostakovich and also to Oistrakh, and resulted in a lot of stress and health problems. Oistrakh has very unique timbral quality, unlike any other violinist, and you can really recognize his sound right away. So I will just play very short beginning. We will talk about Oistrakh's timbre. sounds very deep, and it has a lot of timbral qualities, like sounds like a human voice, which can be sad, angry, hollow, all of these tonal qualities. And through his sound, really, he expressed the emotions because he couldn't do it through the words in the times of censorship. The sonata is in 3 movements, andante, allegretto, and largo andante, so slow, fast, slow, which is similar to modern day writing, like for example Bartok is doing that a lot. And originally Shostakovich gave titles to movements. The first one was Pastoral, the second Allegro Furioso, and the third Variations on the Theme, but then he later took them off. The first movement is Andante in sonata, allegro form, and interestingly, it starts with a 12-tone row in piano in octaves, without any harmony and no chords, just a 12-tone row, which also adds very hollow feeling, empty and searching and unstable. As we see, there are some pitches repeated, for example, E, F, E, and B, A, B. And from F natural to B natural, it's a tritone interval, which also creates this edgy sound. So there's not an accident that he repeated those pitches. Because it's based partially on the 12-tone row, he uses a lot of intervals, especially on violin technique, which he uses octaves, fifths, and fourths. The second movement is also in sonata allegro form. The sound of it is very dissonant, abrasive, has abrupt chords. It really requires huge physical stamina, which why many people just don't play it because it's too hard. And it's very metronomic and machine-like, and the sound really reflects the historic era of Soviet people. There were many blue-collar people, worked in factories, in kolkhozes, and very hard physical work, and this music really reflects that. And also, I feel it's like the struggle against the regime, because it is so hard physically to go through this movement. It's like living in the Soviet Union where you're just surviving through the day. The third movement, in my opinion, is the central movement, and it's Passacaglia. Also, his first violin concerto has Passacaglia, the third movement. Professor Dana Mazurkevich said that when Shostakovich composed the violin concerto, there were only 3 movements, but because of Soviet narrative, he quickly had to compose the scherzo to have really fast and happy ending. But here also, like in the violin concerto, there's a huge cadenza. Also this this movement has big cadenza, but it's separated, has piano part and the violin part. He also has atonal passages and even a quote, in my opinion, from Alban Berg's violin concerto. The whole sonata ends very strangely with the so-called doorbell motif, which I will describe in my presentation. Shostakovich was very inspired by Bach's music after he visited Leipzig for Bach's concert. There was a big concert. He composed preludes and fugues for piano. But he also, in this sonata, you can see similarities of the shapes, how he breaks the chords to violin partitas by Bach. For example, at the top 2 lines, I have Bach's chaconne, and I intentionally took passages that omitted the slurs, so you can compare the shapes with Shostakovich's sonata. So this is the Bach. And then this is Shostakovich. And so on. So you can see he really studied Bach's writing to adapt it for good violin writing. This is a passage from Bach's chaconne from the D major part with the culminating chords. So here I'm going to play. we have similar chords in the culmination part of the Shostakovich's sonata. So definitely inspired by Bach's chaconne or other Bach's violin works. Because there's a lot of 12-tone row, my idea after reading Solomon Volkov's books is that he somehow influenced from Alman Berg, who visited St. Petersburg, those times it was Leningrad, in 1927, and he conducted his opera Wozzeck. And in third movement, in the big number 80, the first couple notes are definitely the same notes as the main tone row of first movement of Berg's concerto. So, and it's significant that Berg's concerto was his last composition, and also the sonata is one of the last compositions of Shostakovich. Music theorist Lynn Henderson states that the Pascalia has the double theme, and I agree. So the first theme is but then in measure 107 he introduces the second theme, which is based on 12-tone row, which has very eerie and ghostly ethereal feeling. And then the piano makes the variations, and towards the end, the 12-tone row together with a more stable Bach-like theme. Now I'll talk about the doorbell motif. In my lessons with Professor Bela Kais, we had a lot of fun discussing how she played this sonata here in Boston, and how it's very scary and so hard. And we together thought that this is the doorbell motif that I will show you later. When the KGB would come to the door in the middle of the night, Shostakovich was known that he had a bag packed with clothes and slept with his shoes under the pillow, being afraid to be sent out to one of those camps. And I'll read out the quote. I was thinking about prison cells, horrible holes where people are buried alive, waiting for someone to come for them, listening to every sound. That was terrifying. You can go mad with fear. Many people couldn't stand the pressure and lost their minds. Awaiting execution is the theme that has tormented me all my life. Many pages of my music are devoted to it. And this is the abrasive doorbell motif, which keeps coming back in the first movement and the last movement, and there is even a variation of it modified in second movement if you look at the analysis. It really sounds like this old electric doorbell in the Soviet buildings. Oistrakh's influence and his unique timbre. So we just listened briefly to his amazing sound. And from Professor Emeritus Dana Mazurkevich, who is actually miraculously a survivor of Nazi concentration camp, she spoke about the Oistrakh's playing approach, his unique timbre, that this was, in his own words, like a human voice. But then I took a class here in Boston University last semester with Professor Glaser, and she talked about the timbre. She's like, but how can human voice, how can it be sounding hollow? Isn't the human voice warm? And then I talked to Professor Yuri Mazurkevich, and he said, no, human voice can have a lot of different ways. It can be angry, sad, hollow, based on the emotions. So studying timbre is very important, and so it was interesting to dedicate the whole entire class studying the timbre. A very interesting review was from London, where he played a concert, and in Musical Times, it was described that Oistrakh was the most masculine of the violinists. So his sound is very strong and masculine, and that's why all the pieces are really hard, because of his physique was very strong. In 1988, Professor Yuri Mazurkevich played a concert at Boston University. He curated the Shostakovich Festival, and he played this sonata. And together with Professor Beilakais, they played in the same concert. And they are the only faculty that I know that have performed this. Professor Mazurkevich and Professor Kais have played this sonata. So that's very remarkable. So the temporal qualities of the sonata and Oistrakh sound: hollow, abrasive, empty, tense, ponticello, and really reflects the time of the USSR. For example, the hollow. Abrasive. In the sonata. Oistrakh had amazing technique, and he loved high piercing notes on the G string. He always put fourth string everywhere. And also, of course, going high on the D string. We all know that he played the Stradivarius violin from the Soviet Union, so his D string sounded beautiful, but most violins don't have a good sound on D string, so their suggestion to go like different fingerings to adapt your instrument, sound of your instrument, but this one. So very masculine sound, and to emphasize this roughness of the sound, he chose a lot of high fingerings. Then Shostakovich wrote a lot of dissonant intervals, for example, going from octave to the ninth, and because it's a stretch on violin, it's hard to vibrate, and that's the whole purpose, to have a tension in the sound. So it's like very tight, tense. There is a very difficult piece, and it requires a lot of technical execution strategies, like doing these exercises. We will briefly compare Professor Beilakais and Oistrakh's fingerings and talk about Frank Fischer's warming up. These are original Oistrakh's fingerings of this very difficult passage, where he always stays in the same position, which is very typical of him. I don't use this fingering, but so it's like going on the A string. For me, it's actually also really challenging. Professor Beilakais is very well known that she's using a lot of finger patterns, and she also studied with George Nigro. So she suggested to keep it in chordal patterns by stretching the first finger down to create a feeling of the chords. And we will talk about this. I deducted it harmonically, put octave lower. This is Schenkerian analysis. And these are the chords that are basically diminished chord going into minor 6/4 in the sequence of A minor, F minor, D sharp minor, and C minor. It is very unstable because the open E is kind of messing with the intonation. It's very challenging and stressful passages. But luckily, the piano plays the same notes in the right hand. I think that's really it's really Shostakovich's pianistic writing, which is really hard for the violin. The cadenza starts with piano, monstrous runs and chords, and has elements of the Passacaglia theme at the basis. But the violin cadenza has the fuzzy tremolo, and it brings melody pattern with the G string notes on gambos. It has very large interval stretches. The changes of the meter, absolute notice in every measure, help free phrasing. So he's indicating how he wants the phrase to sound. It can help to study the Dunis exercises. Dunis was a Greek pedagogue. So there's an easy setting of the chords where your first finger is on G string, and it's very easy to stretch. But when your fourth finger is on G string, that's considered a difficult setting of double steps. And in Shostakovich's sonata, only in the cadenza we actually have most of those difficult setting chords, and this can help you open up the hand. Center your hand around the fourth finger and stretch your first finger down, not the other way. For me, a big challenge is also not to have tenuto on the long notes. And there is a Simon Fisher's book, Warming Up, there's an exercise where you finger the notes that are written above, but only play the open string. So for example, so I played the note silently with my fingers, but I only played the open string, so that can help, especially in passage in big number 63, which is very challenging. The transformative power of music. Not all music has to be beautiful. When music involves so much human suffering and tragedy, it cannot be beautiful, because it's helping to express the feelings of outrage, sadness, despair. And I think this is a very, very good example of it. My grandfather, Janis Regis, as I mentioned, he was imprisoned in concentration war camp in Moldavia, and he carried stones for 7 years. When he was 17 years old, he was aspiring pianist, but while being captured by Red Army soldiers, he lost one of his arms. With one arm, he carried those stones for 7 years. Somehow he had really big wills to survive. And after 7 years, he survived and returned to the homeland Latvia. And in very rural area, he learned how to play trumpet with one hand. And he created his own amateur ensemble, brass ensemble. So in a way, music was his reintegration and healing and being back in the society as a useful citizen. He had a very low income as the politically repressed person, and he always looked like a person from a bad history, from bad background. But he was very proud and learned many different foreign languages, and he inspired me very much. To this day, this sonata is very rarely performed because of its very enormous technical challenges. Oistrakh's role in composition and performance was crucial. In fact, the first years after the sonata was written, only Oistrakh was the only person who actually played, and later his students. For example, Gideon Kremer, on his first tour to Germany, played this sonata with Philip Gavrilov in the Berlin Concert Hall. It is very abstract and complex piece, so he definitely was not complying with the Soviet government, since it was already written after Stalin's death, because he has two types of writing. One was very direct and really targeted towards the USSR government to sympathize with them, but this one was definitely openly protest against the regime. As we discussed, it's influenced by tonality, atonality, a lot of chromaticism, and many motifs that are also present in many different pieces by him, like his symphonies and cello concerto. There is also a version for orchestra and violin solo, and it's available on YouTube. Augustin Hadelik has a very good recording of it. It definitely reflects the complex history of the Soviet Union, and it very powerfully gives the voice of expression to dark feelings of those who suffered under Stalin's dictatorship and were silenced. And I think it's very important also, as a Nazi concentration camp survivor, Viktor Frankl, who enormously suffered, I liked his quote, and I think it really resonates with this presentation. Everything can be taken from a man, but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude at any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. Sometimes from very dark moments of life, very beautiful things are born, and it's very important to always speak up for things that are wrong, and even this is historic evidence, this piece of these dark times, and playing that gives voice to people who never had a chance to talk. Right now, there's maybe room for 3 questions, and then we will be doing a performance. Would anybody want to ask a question?
I do have a question. So, do you know whether Oistrakh just helped finger the music, or you helped him write the violin part?
That's an excellent question. I think it is both, because there is a recording of them practicing at Shostakovich's apartment, and I listened to it very carefully. And some of the notes were different, and of course you might say, okay, they didn't know the piece yet, but I actually think he might modify a couple of notes. Of course, the music was already written by Shostakovich, but things that were really impossible, I think, then Oistrakh would say he couldn't play. But also, because Oistrakh was so incredible, he actually could play also very difficult things. And that really makes this very challenging for other performers, because we have to, our hands are not the same, our physique is not the same. It's really his piece. Any other questions? Professor Sosowski?
The orchestra arrangement, violin orchestra, was that done by Oistrakh or someone else?
Oh no, I think it's done by somebody else, but I don't have information about that, but I will look it up. It's the notes are, I don't know who's the orchestrator. Yeah, I will look it up for you. Professor Ness?
So, talking about Oistrakh's fingerings and Professor Kai's fingerings, how much would you say was modified to fit your hand?
A lot.
A lot. Okay, so this is the Aija Reke version. Okay.
So I'd say all the like melodic parts are it's basically and all the G string passages, those are Oistrakh's, but all kind of tricky passages I think more in the patterns, so those are all modified, and some double steps because they are kind of very difficult, so I just also fit what's good for my smaller hand.
Yeah, you should create a new version. I'm serious. Yeah.
So now we'll be
Just
last question.
So, do you have any? Did you encounter any quotes from Shostakovich about his own thoughts on this piece late? Because it's unfinished, right? It was written in 1968. He died 75. So there's still 7 years between writing and dying. So I was wondering whether he at some point just decides that it's not worth to finish that piece, or just other circumstances.
Yes, interesting question. The first movement is unfinished. The second and third movement is finished. The first movement, it feels a little bit in the development section of something not really connecting with recapitulation. So, but there's he never spoke about it. I guess he wanted to probably come back and rework it. But like the second and third movement are compositionally very rigorous, but the first movement isn't. Okay, now we'll be performing. Thank you.
So who finished?
Which? The first movement? Nobody.
Can you please close the door? everybody for coming and for your time listening to the lecture and our performance.
Thank you.
And thank you for
Great pleasure.
preparing me. Thank you.
That's okay.
Well,